Hello and welcome to my channel. During my last Victorian mantle project, I happened to dig out this wool that I had in my stash. It was soft and quite luxurious, and even better, it didn't fray. I didn't end up using it, but just couldn't put it away. What if I made myself a super cute little Red Riding Hood cloak? But first I had to do some research. So I dug through the webs of information and found out about cardinal cloaks that best fit the description. Cardinal cloaks got their name from their red color. They were made out of dense wool broadcloth, and they were fashionable in Britain and North America during the late 18th and early 19th century. In fact, these cloaks were so popular that they were mass-produced in England and shipped to America. The length of women's cloaks varied from hip length to somewhere mid-calf, although there is this cloak in Met that seems to reach all the way down. Unfortunately, this seems to be the only cloak that has pictures of it in public domain. If you Google cardinal cloak, you will find plenty of examples in other museums. I'll also link some really good resources down below. Generally, women's cloaks were shorter than men's, perhaps because the numerous petticoats were enough to keep the lower portions of the body warm. I decided to make a half-circle cloak. To make most use of the cloak, I wanted a detachable hood with a small round capelet-like yoke collar. As the hood is clearly 18th century hood, I can make this cape fit later periods by removing the hood. I then started figuring out the pattern. There are many measurements given for extant cloaks that I could use for the reference. However, I also wanted to use my fabric in the most economical way and make the biggest cloak with as little piecing as possible while still using as little fabric as possible. Well, isn't this also the way the people thought in the 18th century? So, let's start with a half circle and add a neckline. Now, to add gathers, we must stretch the pattern a bit like this. This would already be a pretty good pattern. We could just lay it on the fabric and cut it out. However, this takes a lot of fabric. If we instead turn the fabric 90 degrees like this and split the pattern, we can use the whole width of the fabric in a much more economical manner. The added seam has an extra bonus as it makes easy to add slits for arms. Even better, if you are short of fabric, you can construct a hood from the piece left over if you just do a little bit of piecing. So, now we can reverse engineer the whole process and realize that the most economical size for a cloak is determined by the fabric width. The width of the center back piece is then the width of the fabric, and the width of the side piece is half of that. Okay, so now I sort of had my basic pattern and I could start making my cloak. I could start with the main cloak and figure out the detachable hood later. Here I have my fabric folded up and I place the pattern pieces on it. I had a bit difficulty in maneuvering the amount of fabric and the big pattern pieces, especially as during the Christmas holidays my kids had commandeered the living room floor for their gaming. So here was I sandwiched between the fridge and the dining table, trying to make most of the space I had available. I pieced the hood as I think it not only saved me some fabric, but also added a nice period effect. While I was doing it, I realized that this layout explains a weird grain line in one of the extant hoods described in the book Costume Close-Up. I didn't want to leave the front edges raw, as they are subjected to more handling. I remembered the remnants of silk shawl I had already destroyed when lining my Victorian morning costume. At that time I only used the black side of the shawl. The other side was red satin and it was just perfect for making trims for the cloak. So I cut strips from the silk satin shawl to make binding for the edges. The first thing to do was to bind the edges of the armholes. I sewed the binding to the edge, right sides together. At the cusp, I made two small perpendicular clips to the cape to make a nice turn. I then turned the binding over the edge and folded the raw edge neatly inside. I slip-stitched the inside edge of the binding in place. If you are making a binding like this, it's easier to figure out the triangular turn of the binding with a piece of cotton bias binding that is less slippery than this silk satin that was slippery and frayed like crazy. What I basically did, however, was pull the whole binding to the right side, then I pulled the center fold of the binding up to form the point of the triangle, and the binding settled in nicely. To keep the fold in place, I slip stitched around and leather stitched the sides of the triangle together along the gap in the middle. Next, I could sew the side seams. I did this with alternating back stitches and running stitches. After the side seams, I sewed the gathering stitches to the neckline. I started about 12 cm from the edge and made 2 rows of gathering stitches with cotton yarn. I used rather sturdy yarn that I left in place to hold the gathers neatly. While I'm talking about gathering, we can gather up the hood as well. As I mentioned, I pieced the hood from 3 separate pieces, but I did that while at my friend's, so I couldn't film it. However, I was unsure what could be the best way to create the fan gathers. I wasn't happy with this first method, as there were way too many gathers, so I ripped it away. I then tried to pleat, and even sewed the pleated seam. I didn't like the look of this either, as the pleats are spread in too big an area. Finally, I combined these 2 methods by sewing very widely separated gathering stitches with which to make cartridge pleats. Now it looked pretty good. I probably should have added some supporting stitches to the wrong side to keep the gathers in place, but I didn't realize that option existed until later. Next, I needed to make a collar. I decided to make the collar 8 cm high, which meant that the rectangular piece needed to be twice as high plus the seam allowance. Originally, I cut the collar a bit too long so that I could then dry it on and shorten it later. I interfaced the inner portion collar with hair canvas. I first pasted the hair canvas on loosely. The idea is to keep the canvas in place but allow it to move enough to curve smoothly to the collar shape. I then patch stitched the hair canvas to the collar while curving the collar over my hand. With the patch stitching done, I sewed the ends of the collar. I trimmed the corners and turned the collar the right way around. I basted the edges and pressed the collar in shape. Back to the main cloak. Before I could attach the collar, I needed to finish the front edges of the cloak. I cut more strips of silk and bound the edges the same way I had already bound the armholes. Now it was time to add the collar. I first pressed the collar seam allowances in, then I sewed the collar seam from the front opening to the point where the gathers start from both sides. Now I spread out and arranged gathers evenly. Then I sewed each of the gathers individually to the outer collar edge. I finished the collar by turning the inner collar edge over the seam and slip stitching it in place. Now the cloak looks pretty good. Next we need the pattern for the yoke color of the hood. I decided to create this scalloped edge that features in many extant cloaks. I started draping the shape on the dress form using cheap cotton from IKEA as fabric. The first attempt was a little short at the front and flared a bit too much at the back. I then made another version that fit a bit better. The neckline was a bit too small, so I marked where it needed to be trimmed. Now we have our yoke pattern and we can cut it from the wool. This time I didn't want to leave the edges raw, so I also need to cut lining. Finishing scalloped edges requires patience. If you try to take shortcuts, finished color will curve and be lumpy and well, just look awful. If you aren't ready to do all the notching and basting and hand finishing, it is better to abandon the scallops altogether. So here I am carefully notching and clipping the edges. I notched the tops of the scallops and clipped the valleys to make the seam allowance curve in neatly. Then I basted the seam allowance in place. After the basting, I pressed the seam allowance carefully. This was also the way I pressed the collar and all the seams open. Then I cut the lining out of this cotton flannel and clipped and notched the edge the same way as with the outer color. Next, I could align the lining and the outer yoke. I started carefully folding the lining seam allowance under, making sure that about 2 mm of the outer fabric showed over the edge to the lining side. This made sure that the lining won't later peek from under the yoke collar. I first pasted the lining in place and then slip stitched the edge by hand with silk thread. I lined the hood with the same fabric and constructed the lining the same way as with the outer hood. Before attaching the lining from the edges, I made a thread loop or a crochet chain that connected the tip of the lining to the main hood. This way the lining won't get pulled out. I was almost attaching the hood to the yoke collar when I realized I needed to finish the front edges of the hood. Here you can see the only shortcut I took if you look carefully. Namely, I basted the front edge with my sewing machine. This basting line was covered with the binding, so it wasn't visible in the finished hood. Finally, I can sew the hood onto the collar. For some reason, I sewed first the outer fabrics and then realized that I needed to have the hood lining attached to the same seam. So I could have just basted the collar edge of the hood and the lining together and sewn them in one go. I finished the lining by slip stitching the collar seam closed. I spent some time thinking about options on how to attach the hood and the cloak together. I decided to add thread loops and ribbons. First, I sewed 2 3 cm wide ribbons to the front of the cloak for closure. Then I added 2 thread loops to the yoke collar so that those ribbons from the cloak could be threaded through them. This way the hood didn't need closure of its own. To keep the hood securely in place, I also added 3 pairs of ribbons and thread loops to fasten the hood and the cloak together. Now finally, it is time for the final reveal. This time I asked my daughter to model for me because you'll see. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to make a similar cloak, there's a link to the pattern down below. You can also find the pattern through my blog. If you like this video, please subscribe and share it with your friends. See you soon. Bye!